I love fantasy maps. We have the classics like Middle-earth and Westeros and Earthsea, but then there's also the Northern Realms and the Ashen Sea and Mystara and Exandria and Tamriel, and there are so many others. Like, I've never played the EU4 mod and Benar, and for that matter, I've never played Europa Universalis 4, but the map for the mod is one of the coolest fantasy maps I've ever seen. Like, what's going on with the giant crater? What's happening on all those remote islands? Looking at these maps, you can just get such a strong sense of the history, the politics, and the supernatural forces in the world. Now, I get why, as a conscious choice, authors or game developers might not want to provide a map, because it can really lock readers or players into a specific perspective on the world. This is why authors like Terry Pratchett and N.K. Jemisin have, at various points in their careers, consciously rejected including maps in some of their books, although both of them did later include maps of their worlds in later books. At any rate, as a way to get inspired to build out a story, as a way to keep track of everything that's going on, fantasy maps are really helpful. So in this video series, I'm trying to build software that'll let us generate new fantasy maps. I know some very useful tools already exist out there, but none do exactly what I'm envisioning. There's a lot I want to cover eventually, but the main goals are something like this. First, I want to be able to generate maps of fantasy worlds that feel full of magic and larger than life. I'm thinking hyper-realistic terrain features, landscapes that show the effects of long ago magic, political entities that would never make sense in the real world but would be cool in a fantasy setting. Second, I want to be able to generate lots of layers to show the world through different lenses. One single map can't really show terrain and cities and political boundaries and everything else all at the same time, at least not without looking like a complete mess. So I want to be able to generate all of these layers at once for the same world so you can toggle them on and off in software like QGIS. And finally, I'd like to make a version of the software freely available. Given my coding abilities, this is probably going to mean posting the source code on GitHub somewhere with an explanation of how to use it, but maybe I'll figure out a point and click interface as well. So, all of that's a really ambitious agenda. I'm not going to be able to do it all today. As a first step, I'm just going to show how I generated some relatively realistic looking terrain. This might sound like a minimal first step after talking a big game about larger than life fantasy maps, but we just want a baseline here. We want something that looks like a plausible real world terrain map to start with, and we're going to work from there. And because we're just using this as a starting point, we do not need to model processes like plate tectonics and erosion to get an actual map based in real world geology. It just has to be a plausibly realistic map with some randomness and roughness, but like also large scale continuity so that we get meaningful structures like seas and continents and flatlands. And how can we use pseudo random number generation, the type a computer gives us, to build that kind of terrain that won't just look like structureless foam? Because this is random noise, and this is random noise, and so is this, but none of those really look map-like. Ideally, we'd like results that remind us of real-world terrain, like this, or this, or this, or this, or this. Leave a reply if you can identify all five of those real-world Earth maps, by the way. But anyway, once we can build terrain maps like this, where there's transitions and jaggedness, but also continuous land masses and elevation changes that remind us of the real world, that's hopefully going to be enough to start gussying it up and adding in, political boundaries and hyper-realistic magical attributes and everything else we want. And fortunately, it turns out that this kind of plausible terrain generation is pretty much a solved problem. We can use something called Perlin noise, which generates the right type of random looking patterns based on a really simple idea. Let's start out with a clock hand that points in some direction. I'm going to put it at 12 o'clock for now, but it could point this way or this way or this way. But for now, let's keep it here. Next, let's color in all the pixels around the clock hand depending on how close they are to the direction it's pointing. So this pixel directly above the clock hand is pointing straight at it, so let's make it really bright. And conversely, this pixel directly below the clock hand is pointing directly away from it, so let's make it really dark. And for anything in between, we can color it in between really light and really dark. And repeating this for every pixel gives us this nice gradient, where the closer you are to the direction it's pointing, the brighter the pixel is. And if we spin the clock hand to different angles, the gradient rotates with it. And like, so far so good, but that doesn't give us anything that looks like terrain. This just gives us a single uniform gradient. To get more interesting structures, what we can do is add more clock hands. So let's start with a grid like this, with 25 clock hands all pointing in different directions. This next part is a little tricky to explain, but it's the part that makes Perlin noise work, so bear with me. For each pixel, let's find the 4 clock hands it's closest to, and color the point according to how close the pixel is to the directions those 4 nearest neighbor clock hands are pointing. In this example, this one is medium bright because that circled clock hand is pointing in a somewhat nearby direction. And this other nearest neighbor clock hand is a little brighter because the clock hand is pointing almost straight at the pixel, and actually the same with this one. Meanwhile, the fourth nearest neighbor clock hand is pointing away, so the pixel is darker in that version. And in theory, for each pixel on the grid, we could repeat this process, and we would get 4 different colors depending on how close the pixel is to the directions those 4 clock hands are pointing. And from here, all we need to do is combine those 4 colors depending on how close the pixel is to each of those 4 clock hands. So nearer clock hands get a higher weight, further ones get a lower weight. And we can repeat this process for every pixel, like this one, or this one. And for each one, we're going to have the same setup where we look at the directions the 4 nearest clock hands are pointing, color the pixel accordingly for each of those 4, and then combine them based on how close it is to each of those 4 nearest neighbor clock hands. And this next part is a little more difficult to visualize, but the fact that we're coloring pixels based on how close they are to the direction of those 4 nearest neighbor clock hands means that the input colors are going to change really gradually as we move around the clock hand from pixel to pixel. And the way we weight the average based on location means we're going to get gradual changes as we move across the grid of pixels. But all those pixel colors are based on the random directions of the underlying clock hands, and so spinning the clock hands around will change the colors in the output. So this is a really promising strategy for getting something that looks random but also has structure that changes gradually across the grid of pixels. And in fact, if we try this with a slightly larger grid and then increase the number of clock hands to get an even higher resolution, and start layering the grids of pixels we get from the different resolutions of clock hands on top of each other, and keep increasing that resolution and increasing it further, and further, which ends up running smoothly even on my busted laptop, we start to get a level with some meaningful spatial structure to it, and something that maybe even looks a little bit like terrain if you squint, or if I adjust the colors to make it look more map-like. So this is pretty cool. Just by overlaying a bunch of those grids of clock hands and then coloring pixels based on their proximity to those clock hands, and then taking the average across the 4 nearest neighbors for each pixel on the grid, we get these pictures that have random noisiness and jagged edges, but also large-scale structure. And by using a different random seed, a different seed for the pseudo-random number generator that sets the directions of all those clock hands, we can get new maps that look like this, or this, or this. And this is pretty satisfying. I think it gets us most of the way to that plausible initial starting terrain that we can use to layer on top everything else we want in terms of fantasy map generation. But I think a few tweaks are going to make it look even more realistic. First off, and first and foremost, the way that I've made the sea level on these maps is just picking an altitude and saying, okay, that altitude is sea level. Everything below it is ocean, everything above it is land. And like, that's not the worst approximation, but it does have some unrealistic limitations. It gives us those disconnected ocean regions in kind of the north and northwest parts of the map, and it also guarantees that no land can ever be below sea level, because we're defining the ocean as everything that is below a given elevation. And that's a big problem if we're trying to make maps of kind of larger than life worlds. Some of the most extreme larger than life places in the real world, like Dalol and Death Valley, are below sea level. And we want to preserve that option for the maps that we're making. So, what I'm going to do instead is start at the lowest elevation on the map and fill in the ocean upwards from that lowest point. And at each elevation, checking to make sure that we're only filling in a contiguous set of pixels with ocean. And we can keep raising the sea level until we hit the desired share of the map that we'd like to have covered with ocean. And doing that gives us way cooler coastlines, it turns out, with narrow straits and tiny islands and some big inland depressions well below sea level. Here's another version with a sea level contour that makes those depressions a little clearer. I'm actually really pleased with how this looks, and we can start at a really low ocean coverage to get a world with really low sea level and some big deep depressions. Maybe those could be lakes in a later iteration. And we can crank up the desired ocean coverage, and the water gradually gets filled in from that lowest point, and it gets higher and higher and higher, and it fills in this really consistent way every time from that deepest point up. And it gives us new bays and straits and peninsulas as we raise the water level. And again, all of this the whole way is just based on that same underlying set of clock hands. And eventually we get back to that map I showed before. And this is something that's going to be relatively easy for the user to configure and explore and just kind of play around with. So, I think this map looks pretty good, and the other two changes I'm going to make at this stage are relatively minor. First off, I've allowed for more variation in the coastline sloping down towards the ocean, so that not every coastline is like a really gradual gradient. When you think about how the Perlin noise generation with the clock hands works, it doesn't actually know where the land ends and the ocean starts, so it doesn't know to add in the steepness that characterizes some real-world shorelines. To get more variation in the shorelines right around the coast, I'm just going to make the elevation changes steeper as you get down towards sea level. And secondly, I'm going to add a few more islands in. Islands just make maps look more interesting. They add visual variety to the oceans, and maybe from a storytelling perspective, they add more interesting isolated settings, and maybe they make long sea journeys more feasible. This ended up being a little trickier than I was expecting. I'll show you some examples. Here's a map without those two changes, with a different seed for the pseudorandom number generation that sets the direction of all the clock hands. Here's how things look when I adjust the steepness of the shorelines. And finally, here's how it looks with the additional island generation. And with another random seed, here's how things look before those changes. Here's how it looks with that shoreline gradient adjustment. And finally, here's how it looks with that new island generation. And as you can see, this does give us more islands, but it doesn't really give us big, satisfying archipelagos and islands in the middle of nowhere, so I think this is something we're going to have to revisit later. But at this point, at least we can generate some plausible looking terrain as a starting point. And this doesn't necessarily look like what you'd get from real world geological processes, because we're not trying to make a map based on real world geology. We're just trying to get a basic starting map that we can add on all those larger than life fantasy aspects afterwards. So, I think for now this is a good place to wrap up this video. We have a plan for what we're doing here, we can generate some terrain, and we've made a couple tweaks that make that terrain look a little more interesting. Thanks for watching this video all the way to the end. If you have any feedback on the project, please feel free to leave a comment. It's legitimately really helpful for me to hear whether any of this makes sense and what might be interesting or worthwhile to work on next.